And so it begins my largest project to date, which was originally supposed to be done in 2 months. How naive I was, it ended up taking me 4 months of building. Like any project, and especially with a project this size, getting started is always the hardest step, especially when I have to measure out all the dimensions and figure out how I am going to fit this properly in the fullest block height, which is just the standard 0 to 256 because I'm doing this in 1.16. It is a bit daunting trying to build a structure at this scale, especially when I couldn't fly out far enough or have my render distance high enough to be able to tell if it was actually proportioned correctly. But I made my best guess for the height of the roof and the distance from the roof to the floor, and just went with it and started building out some shapes. I wanted this carousel to be as detailed as I could possibly get it, so I tried to work with very interesting angles and unique shapes. I'm sure I could have made it even more detailed than I did, but I am pleased with the simple design that I came up with. Simple, yes, but still complicated to build. The biggest thing about doing a project this size is doing lots and lots of planning. So now that I had the basic size of the structure in place, I went to size up a single horse and figure out how many of these are actually going to fit on this carousel. So after modeling one, all I have to do is revolve it. Once I got all of the horses in place, or at least just the first row of horses, I noticed something about this carousel. It's just not big enough. It wasn't going to fit my original vision, so 2 weeks into it, I'm going to have to redo this entire structure. Like I told myself then, if I'm going to be making this carousel, I might as well do it right and make it as big as I want. Looking back, I'm really glad I made this decision early on because it ended up looking 10 times better with a larger size. I didn't actually record myself resizing the carousel, but essentially I took what you see here and scaled it up. To give you a visual, the original carousel had a diameter of about 400 blocks and could only contain 14 horses max. The new size, I extended the radius by 100 blocks, so it now has a diameter of 600 and could contain 32 horses. This looks so much better. And here's a visual of all the horses laid out on the new size. The old one, I would have only gotten 2 rows of horses. This one, I was able to split them up into 3 rows, and it just looks so much fuller and so much better. Now all of these horses here are the same shape, so I'm gonna have to go back through them all and give them some unique shapes. Because naturally, we want to have as much variety as we can with this carousel, so I ended up reshaping half of them, giving me 16 unique models to use, so each model will appear twice on this carousel. This process did take quite a while to do though, and was especially more challenging having to work with all these different angles. Once all of the horses were done, which probably took quite a while, I wanted to continue figuring out the structure of the carousel, specifically the inside portion. I wanted to get as much of the structure and shaping done for everything before moving on to texturing, since that is important for me knowing how everything's going to fit together before I go into coloring everything. I interrupt myself here to bring you this very important message. It was about this time in the process of the carousel that I nearly lost half of my progress due to one fatal mistake. If you are working on anything in creative, especially something this big, please be sure to make frequent backups of everything so that you don't accidentally use the revolve command on a large area in the wrong place and you are unable to undo it. Yes, this is what happened to me, and I had to redo half of my carousel. Thankfully, half of it was still intact, so I was able to copy and paste it over, but it could have been much worse. I did make frequent backups after this, and you should too if you value your sanity. I did redo parts of the structure later on, but now that I had all the basic parts laid out, I felt like this would be a good time to start coloring in some horses. The first couple horses was me trying to figure out the process for how I was going to design these. At first I started off with some lazier approaches for the first few, but then after the first 5 or so, I kind of got to be a little more picky with how I was doing them. But on average, I would say one horse took 3 to 4 hours to color and decorate, although there were a couple that took me 7 or 8 hours. But I did develop a process that went roughly in this order: add the pole, color the horse, add the bridle, add the saddle and decorations, and finally add the mane and the tail. One thing I knew for sure about this carousel is I wanted all the horses to be very unique, and I also wanted to have some specialty horses. One of the specialty horses I had in mind was doing a miniature of my Mechasus that I built 2 years ago, and this one was one of the longer ones to do just because of all of the mechanisms and stuff involved with it. I just had to make this an Easter egg because the Mechasus is one of my favorite builds, and I thought it'd be so cool to have it appear on the carousel. Not far into the process of doing the horses, I realized this carousel is going to take much longer. I ended up spending 2 months of doing nothing but horses. And I was actually very surprised that I never really burnt out on this project. I was always really happy to work on it, and I think it's in part because this was a project I had been going to do for a long time because I've always loved carousels and I've always loved horses. So because it's something that really interests me, that made it way more enjoyable. I do want to say I appreciate everyone who did hang out in all of those live streams I did of doing these horses and the rest of the carousel. I really do feel like we did it all together, even though you were just there for moral support, but it was nice to see other people getting just as interested in it as I was and be patient with me as I did this for weeks and weeks and weeks. I won't be showing a time lapse of every single horse just because there's so many, but I did give them all names, so we're going to do a quick roll call of all of the horses on this carousel. We have Alaska, Apollo, Autumn, Biscuit, Cinnamon, Eclipse, Eden, Emma, Flora, Giovanni, Gloria, Grace, Greg, Griswold Quentin Desmond VI, Jasper, Juliet, Lily, Luna, Mabel Stirrup, Marvin Embers, Minnie Mechasus, Mozart, Odysseus, Olivia, Onyx, Rocky, Rosemary, Sahara, Scarlet, Sunny, Toffee, and Waldo. It is very hard for me to pick a favorite, but I'm very curious. If you do have one, please let me know. We'll see which one of these horses is the most popular. With the horses finally out of the way, I can get into coloring the rest of this structure, starting with the floor, which I recolored several times and ended up using an image brush. I try to be careful when I use the image brush to make sure that it still looks like it goes with the rest of the build, especially when everything else is hand textured, so I made sure to use a very subtle texture or one that wasn't too distracting from all of the other pieces on the carousel. With the roof, I textured it a little more manually because it did require a bit more precision. Now I've reached the point of this carousel where I'm trying to fill it up with as much detail as I possibly can, and I'm going to start with some paintings on the outside edges. Often carousels do have paintings or really fancy decorations like this, so I went ahead and added 16 different paintings on the outside of the carousel. As for what the paintings were going to be, I decided to draw inspiration from the horses that appear right behind them, either from their name or appearance. The first painting I did with the horse, which I later turned into a Pegasus, is the only exception to this. It was a plan that I developed after making that one. It was really fun trying to incorporate pixel art into my 3D build. Some of them turned out better than others, but I do have a favorite, and that's the space painting. I just think it turned out the best, so that's why it's my favorite. The next thing to do is the tedious process of adding all of the lights. And no, I didn't do them all by hand, just about a quarter of them by hand, and then I was able to copy and rotate and paste. The trickiest part, I think, is knowing what order to do things in, because sometimes things would get in the way of other things that I was trying to rotate, so you just have to be very specific with what you're copying and pasting, and it all works out. Since we are nearing the end of this carousel, it was about this time where I was just trying to find any opportunity I could to include more detail. I was really second guessing myself on whether I've added enough, because if I'm going to spend this much time on it, I wanted to make sure it looked really good to where I was really happy with it. But at the same time, I really just wanted it to be done, and since I was so close, I did sacrifice some details I could have added for simpler things. An example of this being the inside panels. I wasn't sure if I wanted to do those as paintings or mirrors. I knew that paintings would take more time and mirrors would be simpler, but I really didn't know which one would look the best. I ended up doing the mirrors because I felt like it was just a simpler option to do at the time, but looking back, I am glad I did it that way because I think the final render does look better because of it. Especially with all those lights around the mirrors, which I originally wasn't going to add, but I'm glad I kept them in the end. And I did end up adding extra paintings too, so there are more paintings to be added, just not in the most visible section of the carousel. And these paintings I wanted to be more Minecraft related. So there are 4 panels each dedicated to each dimension in Minecraft, and I really liked working on these. These ones are much simpler than the outside paintings, but they were really cute and fun to work on. The final detail of this carousel was painting the ceiling, and this was something I wasn't originally going to do, but since people suggested it in the live stream, I went ahead with one of the suggestions and tried it and ended up liking it, so that is how this came about. But I finally reached that point where I couldn't think of anything else to add, so this carousel is officially complete. I hope you all enjoyed this time-lapse. I certainly had a lot of fun building it. Be sure to stick around to the end to see the final render, and I hope to see you again soon.